This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host. And although my voice sounds like it's been run over by a semi-truck, I'm here.
And then backed up over a second time.
I am here in the flesh with Dr. Richard Blackaby. It's good to see you, Richard.
It's always good to be with you. And I have to just kudos to my son-in-law. Climbed up a 24-foot ladder trying to help put flashing back on my house.
Well, you know, it's
if you'd been killed, my wife would never have forgiven me.
Nor would mine. So
I do appreciate.
It's a good thing that all worked out.
I've been on the road here lately, and I get home. My wife says, part of our house is on the ground. Oh, really?
Oh, just a bit of flashing. Nothing structural, at least.
Yeah, that was a relief, but still, right at the peak of the house, there was a little tenuous
dicey.
there to try to get
dicey.
to that point. So
yeah, well, it's good to see you and be back in the flesh. You've been just on the go the whole month of March, and it's not stopping. This is a brief window that you're in town, and
I spoke in 3 different time zones last week.
Well, that must have been confusing.
On several fronts, yeah.
Just make notes so that to say that you're glad to be here
which time, what state are we in? 3 different states, 3 time zones, and leaving tomorrow and then headed to Alaska. I'm actually going to be speaking in North Pole, Alaska.
North Pole. We'll say hey to the big man,
guy.
The big man himself, and tell him I've been a good boy this year so far.
Well, I'll do what I can on that front.
Well, good. All that aside, we've got some exciting stuff coming up here. You've been speaking just a ton, and I know the Lord's been using you in various meetings, and so that's always exciting for us to hear back here at the home base when you're out and on the road and just meeting with people, and it's encouraging to see what God has been doing through our ministry, through you. But one of those areas in which I think the Lord has really blessed you is in your writing, and obviously the content that you write. But He's also blessed you with amazing editors.
Oh
that have taken
you married my best editor.
That have taken what you write and make it comprehensible to the everyman. And so you've got a new book coming up. It's called The Ways of God, and maybe just tell us a little bit about this book. We're actually gonna kind of dive into this a little bit over the next few podcasts, but maybe just from the outset, tell us a little bit about this book, how it came to be, and what people can expect. It's going to be coming out on April 18th through B&H Publishing.
Yeah, I'm real excited about it. This book, I've had some people that have read it, previewed it for me, and give me some feedback. And I've had people saying it's maybe the best book that I've written so far. And just called The Ways of God, how God reveals Himself to a watching world. And so it's just saying that with God, what He does is important, obviously, but He also does things a certain way. And it's not the way the world typically does it. And so what happens a lot of times is, and we've talked about this before, people will try to do the right thing, but they'll do it the wrong way. And then they'll get confused because they'll think, well, I thought this is what God wanted me to do, but when I did it, it blew up in my face. Or I did it, but then God never blessed. God never provided the funding. God didn't bless this business we started. And it was all to the glory of God. And we were going to, use our profits to invest in an orphanage and, all this stuff. And why wouldn't God have blessed that? And oftentimes the problem is they did the right thing, but they did it the wrong way. They just, and what that means a lot of times is that, we don't realize just how much we have been soaking and marinating in the ways of the world. It's just so natural for us. It's like fish swimming in water. You just take the water for granted because that's the world that you've always lived in. And so when we are just bombarded by the worldly ways of thinking, the way the business operates, the way television sends advertisements blasting at us all the time, what we learn in school, the way other people talk, there's just a certain way that the world does things. And typically they do it in a way that doesn't take God into serious account. The world typically does things in a way that's kind of self-centered. It's about us. It's about what it appeals to our fleshly desires, our pride, our ego. And It relies upon our own strength. It makes God often or money the God instead of God, and so we're taught to operate that way. And so without even realizing it, we just take what we've always learned and assume that's how everybody does it, and we've taken it into following God. And then when it doesn't work out, when God doesn't bless, we get confused. And and so there, of course, and so this book looks first at just the ways of God and what that means, and then it looks at particular ways of God. And what I argue in this book is that God's ways are based on his character. So, for instance, because God is holy, then everything he does is holy. His ways are holy because he's holy. And so to know the ways of God, then you have to understand the character of God. There are just certain things God won't do. He won't do things in an unholy way because that would violate who he is. And so I don't think his ways change. I don't think his ways change from the Old Testament to the New Testament. I think he was loving in the Old Testament. He's loving in the New Testament. He's just as holy in the New Testament as he was in the Old. Now his methods can change. How he expresses himself, how he does things, how his deeds, if you will, those can change. And we'll kind of look at that in the next couple of podcasts. But because a lot of times people think, well, the Old Testament God was just a real cruel, harsh, judgmental, fearful God. And then Jesus comes in the New Testament, he's totally different. That's not really the case. When you really look at the Bible, you find that the Old Testament God was full of love. He was gracious, long-suffering. He kept, persisting with the stubborn Israelites that kept disobeying him and worshiping other gods. And and at the same time, sometimes we think God is kind of wrathful. In the Old Testament, he punishes sin, but then the New Testament, he doesn't. And we had someone the other day that was wondering in experiencing God, they said, well, you cited an Old Testament example where God struck someone dead for blatantly disobeying him, and but that's not the New Testament. And we had to say, well, have you ever heard of Ananias and Sapphira? Like, that's the New Testament, and they lied in church, and God struck them dead. God is just as holy in the New Testament as the Old. Now, he doesn't always strike people dead, which I'm grateful for, because if he killed every liar in the church, it might be hard on church attendance. But so he doesn't always do things the same way. But he doesn't always punish sin exactly the same way. But that he hates sin he hates it just as much now as he ever has. And so the ways of God reflect his character. And of course, Isaiah 55 verses 8 and 9 says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, and your ways are not my ways. This is the Lord's declaration. For as heaven is higher than earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. We just don't believe that. We really don't think that God's ways are that different than ours. We just assume that if a plan makes sense to us, it must make sense to God. It must be how God wants to do it, because we're so excited about it. And of course, my dad used to always say, if a plan makes perfect sense to me, he would say, I'm sure it must not be from God, because God's ways just don't always make sense, because he's infinite, he's eternal, he knows the future, he knows all the thoughts of humanity. And so he has so much more at his disposal that, of course, he's not going to do things. I mean, he created the universe. Do you expect a guy who can create the universe with a word to make sense to you? Like, to do things in a way that you understand? Like, that's ludicrous. So his ways just are not they're going to just be counterintuitive oftentimes to what we would think. So that's why he can say, well, if you want to, the last will be first. Well, that doesn't make any sense. We've never seen anybody at the back of the line being first. No one wants to do that. But he said, well, that's how it's going to be. He said the servant will be the greatest, not the one who is served, but the one who serves. Well, none of us are lining up. The world never lines up saying, who wants to get to serve here? We all want to be the one being served. He said, if you save your life, you'll lose it. but if you lose your life, you'll save it. Well, again, that doesn't make any sense to us.
Yeah.
But it's the way of God. It's the way God does things. So, God says the value is in, like, God gets his work done through suffering. You just wouldn't think that an almighty, all-powerful God, that surely there's another way. I mean, if you rule the universe, surely you can come up with a different method where your saints don't have to be martyrs. They don't have to be persecuted. That godly pastors don't get fired arbitrarily by evil people that don't like them. Surely there's a different way God could do it. But so it doesn't make sense to us when God says, no, I love this person very much and I'm very pleased with them, but their path is going to involve suffering. That will confuse us. And so there's a lot to the ways of God that we just have to learn. And, Psalm 25, verse 4, David says, make your ways known to me, Lord. Teach me your paths. And so this is David, probably one of the guys who knew God as well as anybody. And yet he had to say, make your ways known to me. I don't know your ways, he said. And this is a guy who knew God as well as anybody in history.
Yeah.
And yet he's saying, God, teach me your ways, because they just don't make sense to me. I would never figure them out on my own. You're going to have to teach me. And so that's really what we want to do in this book, is just help people learn the ways of God. And of course, it's not exhaustive, but there got to be lots of content. The more you study the ways of God, the more you come across.
Well, I could imagine it being a multi-volume set, if you really were to dive into everything. So,
and you kind of need there's a book like A.W. Tozer wrote on kind of the Pursue the Holy, that looks at the attributes of God, the character of God. And that would be a great companion piece to this too. Like, the one side, it's sort of like, who is he? And then this book would be, well, how does he do things? And so, you may have done studies before on what is God like, what's his character like, but this would say, okay, well, based on that, then how does he act?
Yeah, and how would we expect him to act then? Well, let's take a quick break here, and we'll continue to unpack the ways of God.
Hello, I'm Richard Blackaby, and I'm the author of The Seasons of God. And I want to introduce you into a 6-week online class that Blackaby Ministries International is offering, where I'll be walking with you to understand how God has designed our life to flow through seasons. Life's not meant to be lived in a straight line, the same thing day after day. God constantly is introducing new things and changes and adjustments. He's starting certain things and he's ending other things, and it can often confuse you. This class will walk through how our life flows through seasons, and I think you'll be surprised to look back on your life and realize God has been doing amazing things ever since you were born, and he's got some wonderful things still in store for you in the days to come.
Well, Richard, like you said before the break, that we may have studied God's character, his attributes, but oftentimes I think people in the church get confused about how God does things, and the way that he does things. It can be confusing to us. So maybe just unpack that a little bit more for us in the time we have left.
Right. To know the ways of God, you have to know God, and you have to know him personally. And when you know God well, then you just know that there's just certain things he wouldn't do. And I've seen this a lot, and I'm not saying that I'm just an expert on this, but when you know God, then I've heard people talk about God or pray to God sometimes, and I'll just think that person can't really know the God I know, because that's just not how God would do it. That's not how God would act. I know this TV evangelist just said this about God, but I just know God better than that. I just know that that's not how he does things. I remember years ago, this guy was, he worked for a publisher that I was working with, and he was all excited, and he was this kind of real enthusiastic kind of guy, and he was saying that he was just a big fan of experiencing God, and that he was going around encouraging people with those truths. And I'm like, well, great, that's always good. And he said, yeah, like I tell people, he said, I'm just trying to teach people what your dad teaches in experiencing God. He said, I was on this university campus recently, and I was speaking to some students, and he said, I just said, yeah, you just like Henry Blackaby says, you just need to dream big dreams for God, like just really big dreams, because we've got a big God. And I know my dad well, and I know what my dad teaches well. And I said, well, that's all fine and good, but my dad would never say that. My dad doesn't believe that. And he's like, well, what do you mean? I mean, I said, no, God will do great things, but but it's because God came up with them. Dad never says you dream up a big dream and then ask God to come in and bless it. And so what was interesting was this guy was going around saying, oh yeah, I know Henry Blackaby, and I really know his stuff, and I know what Henry would say if he was here. And it's like, well, no, you don't actually. You've just totally misrepresented him.
Yeah.
And so of course I can do that when it's someone talking about my dad, because I know my dad well and I know what he teaches, maybe as well as anybody on the planet these days. But the same goes with God. When you get to know God well, and then someone says, well, I just believe if you do this, God will do that. If you just pray in faith, then God will give you whatever you want. And God wants you to be happy, and he wants you to be wealthy, and so on. And these seed faiths and different things that various people talk about on television, you would just say that person just can't know God, because that's just not what he says. That's not what he does. So what you'll find is, and a lot of times, you hear someone pray, and I mean, they could be praying very sincerely, and I don't mean this to sound critical, but when you hear some people, what they're asking God to do, you know full well that's just not the way God does things. So you can pray for it, you can ask God, but when you know God and you know his ways, you just know, well, there's no point in asking God to do that, because that's just not how he does things. That would violate his character. That would go against who he is. And so you're asking him to contradict himself by the way you pray, and he's just not going to do that. So if you want your prayers to be answered, then ask God to do things his way, and then you're more likely to get that. And so I've often said the problem with the church today is that the church is trying to do God's work, but do it the world's way. And I'm not saying, and there's lots that we can learn from business and management, leadership principles. Certainly, when the world does things using good leadership principles, those can apply to the church as well. But there's a lot of stuff that the world does that does not necessarily translate straight over to the church. So, when you have churches that go and study Disney World and then say, well, let's just do the same things they do to treat customers or whatever, you got to be careful with that, because the church is not, and God's work is not just the same as the world. And so when you use methods that work in the world, you sort of have to unpack those a bit to say, well, that may be so in the world, that might be so in running a certain kind of business or factory, but is that how God would build his church? And don't just assume because it works in your business that you should just go running to the church and say, hey, I found a way to grow numbers or to grow income. Well, because I've known churches that, for instance, they would try to have a high attendance day and get the crowds in. So they literally they would give away maybe things like 10 speed bikes, and so you'd go to the service and everybody would sit down, and then at a certain point they might tell people, well, look under your seat, and taped under one of your seats is a prize that you might have won a bike today, and everyone's excited, and you think that's they'd pack out the church on that particular Sunday. Nobody would be there again until the next high attendance day, or those people wouldn't be. But you think, well, that would work well for like the Price is Right game show or something, where you don't know which, hopefully I'm sitting in the right lucky seat here, but that's not necessarily how God builds his church. And the same with, sometimes we think, well, we just have the right kind of hot rock band worship team and all kinds of spotlights strobing around and different things happening that people walk in like a rock concert will fill up this building. Well, maybe that's what God wants you to do, but I think God really wants you to focus on him and be moved by the Spirit, not by a heavy drum beat or something. And so we can be confused oftentimes because something works in the world, we just take it straight into the church, or even in business. Just because other businesses do things a certain way to get a lot of sales, that doesn't mean that's the way God wants you to do it. And so, for instance, one of the ways of God, which is pretty obvious, is His ways are holy, and that you read throughout the Bible, whenever you see God portrayed in heaven, like in Revelation chapter 4 and different places, everybody in heaven is crying out at the top of their lungs, "Holy, holy, holy." That's you. You can't look at God and not immediately recognize that He is entirely other than everybody else in heaven. No one else is like Him. No one begins to compare to Him in every way. And of course, that's what a lot of holiness means. It means you're not like the world. You're not like people. It means that you're pure. It means you're righteous. It means you're blameless. It means there's no taint of sin in any way contaminating anything that you do. And so, because God is holy, that means everything He does is done in holiness. It's done in righteousness. And so, of course, in Leviticus and other places, in 1 Peter, it tells us, so we are to be holy because He's holy. So if God does everything in holiness, that means He wants us to do everything we do in holiness. And that's of course, one of the reasons why you need to know the ways of God, because that's the way He wants you to live too. So however God does stuff, that's how you should do stuff. And so when it comes to something like holiness, you have to say, well, so what would that look like if the way I did business, the way I conducted myself, the way I pastored a church, the way I led employees, that all of that was holy? That would mean, for one thing, that you didn't lead just the way the world does. You would lead in a way that honors God, that's righteous, that is blameless, that is above reproach, so that you could conduct yourself in a way where no one can point an accusing finger at you and say that you're a hypocrite. You say one thing, you do another. Holiness means that it's pure. It's not contaminated with mixed messages, contrasting values. It means that what you say you do. There's no inconsistency when you're holy. It means that everything is perfectly consistent throughout. And so it's a heavy thing to stop and say, so the way I'm leading my business, is that holy? For pastors, the way you preach needs to be holy, which means, for instance, you're not plagiarizing someone. Kind of had that. It's like you're preaching down the fire on the congregation, but you stolen that sermon from someone you listened to preach last week. You just listen to their sermon and now you're preaching it. And I'm not saying that you don't ever can pull stuff from other people, but you're not giving them credit. You're making it sound like it was all you, or you're exaggerating the truth because it'll just preach better if I change these details or I exaggerate the details, and it'll, I'm doing this for God. I'm doing this to move people, but now you're lying in your sermon trying to do God's work. And that's often been the case where people, if you stop and look at what they're doing, you would say, well, you're doing it in an unholy way to try to serve a holy God. And that just doesn't work. Can you lead employees? So what if you have to fire someone? Is there a holy way of firing a unperforming employee where you're above reproach? And what does that mean? What does it mean to lead staff? Maybe it's in a secular work setting. Is there a way to lead people in a holy way in a secular job site where you're consistent, you're pure, there's no falsehood in you. You do what you say. You live by what standards you hold for everybody else. And I've had to fire a couple of people in my day, and I've agonized about what would be a God-honoring way to do that. Can you honor God? Can God receive glory by you having to do a difficult thing, like layoffs or firing someone that has to be fired, or holding someone accountable, or giving a reprimand to someone that just violated the company rules? Can you do that in a way that is holy? That, because a lot of times what happens is we do a hard thing, but we we have a temper. We say things out of anger. We say things that are not honoring to Christ because we had to deal with a difficult situation. And leading in a holy manner means you go home at the end of the day and you don't have a lot of regrets.
Yeah.
You don't have everybody buzzing around about, can you believe what he said and what he did? And I've just heard that in so many ways. Even sometimes I hear leaders and they're trying to do a good thing, but for instance, maybe pride gets in. And have you ever heard people, like we've talked about this before, even when they're trying to give a compliment to someone else, it becomes about them, Like instead of me saying, Sam, you did a great job about that, I'll say, well, one of my best moves was when I hired Sam. I could tell. He's pretty rough and raw. Everybody else said, don't hire him, but I knew that he'd work out. It's like, well, why don't you just say, good job, Sam? You knocked it out of the park. But those kind of people that they just can't help but insert themselves. And really, you just see pride creeping in. And you say, that's too bad, because what they did was fine. But instead of doing it in a holy way where the glory went to God, where the way they conducted themselves was in a way that was God-honoring in humility and so on, they made it a self-centered thing, and it's not holy anymore. It's worldly. That's what the world does. It always wants to be on the stage, everybody admiring them. And instead of being holy and doing things contrary to the way the world does, in a way that is as a servant, as someone in humility, as someone who thinks of others before themselves, it ended up just being about them. Just the same way someone accepting an Academy Award is, they're going to, not all of them do it that way, but where it becomes, well, this is just more self-promotion. And so, there's a lot that could be said about just to do things in a holy manner, how you lead a business, how you deal with conflict, but ultimately, and how you lead your family, how you raise your kids. I think when you raise your kids in a holy manner, it doesn't guarantee that they will all necessarily follow Jesus, but I think if you parent them in holiness, at least they can't blame you. If they walk away from God, it won't be because they point to you and say, well, Sam, you were just such a hypocrite. Dad, you said one thing at church, you said something else at home. Holy living means you were entirely consistent and you did everything in a way that would honor God. Your kids may still reject that, but holiness means you're blameless, you're above reproach. And now it's just on them. They just chose to walk away from God. But and so doing things in a holy way, I encourage our listeners, just think about all the different responsibilities you have, the different kinds of roles that you play, and then just put that lens of holiness over top of that and saying, all the things I do, there's a holy way of doing them, and there's an unholy way, a worldly way. And what adjustments do I need to make so that I could look back over the way that I conducted myself and say, I chose the way of holiness just the same way that God does.
Well, that's great. And like we said at the beginning, we're going to do a few episodes on your new book, The Ways of God, and that's going to be coming out April 18th. And
we should say maybe in the notes too, I know Lifeway was there 250 that are signed already.
Yeah, so if you
pre-order or purchase from them
through Lifeway,
we can give
one
the
of those
site
first
in the show notes there.
Yeah, I'll leave a link to that in the show notes.
Well, I signed a bunch of books so that they would they could give away some signed copies to the first ones, and so you're getting one of the very first books if you get a signed one.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.